Hello everyone, Mr. Seymour again. This week we will be working with Chapter 5 in your Abernathy textbook, which discusses the protections of civil rights. After reading this chapter, you will be able to understand that securing civil rights requires both actions by individuals and groups to claim them and by governments to secure and protect them. To trace the history of racial segregation in America and the ratification of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which lays the foundation for later struggles to civil rights. Explain efforts to end legal segregation, the strategies used and their successes as well as their failures. To trace the history of efforts to secure civil rights for American women, and to evaluate the ways that diversity of Americans' identities shapes efforts to secure civil rights in the 21st century. Now, this chapter begins by describing civil rights as an essential component of American political culture. Civil rights are different from civil liberties because civil liberties are generally protections from what the government can do to citizens, which we call negative freedoms. Civil rights, on the other hand, are positive freedoms in that they are protections from discrimination provided through government action. The chapter's first story illustrates the importance of civil rights by presenting Judith Heumann, a person who's confined to a wheelchair due to childhood illness. As we examine the case of Ms. Heumann, we will be looking at the Americans with Disabilities Act and its important provisions. In her life, Ms. Heumann has had to fight to be treated equally and frequently has advocated the government, whether the courts or the legislature, to provide civil rights for persons with disabilities, specifically from discrimination in education, employment, and other key areas of life. One of the major civil rights fights in American history is the fight to end legal segregation by race. As recently as the 1960s, large parts of the country were legally segregated by race regarding education, employment, transportation, and other areas. And we call that de jure segregation. The other side of segregation is de facto segregation, which is segregation by tradition or culture. The fight to end segregation, and by extension to improve the civil rights of African Americans, was largely fought in the courts after World War II. Key civil rights groups like the NAACP challenged a number of these laws and eventually convinced the Supreme Court that legal segregation violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Another critical civil rights battle has been against discrimination towards women so that they can be more fully integrated into society. While not subject to segregation based on gender, women prior to the 20th century lacked critical rights, such as voting, property ownership, and equal wages. Despite some overlap regarding discrimination, the women's rights movement was largely separate from the civil rights movement for African Americans. Although women received the right to vote with the 19th Amendment, civil rights activists have continued to fight against other sources of discrimination against women. We will also be looking at the struggles of other minority groups, including Native Americans, LGBT rights, and with the case of Obergefell versus Hodges, which resulted in national legalization of same-sex marriage, and the continued struggle of Latinos and Latinas as they continue to employ tactics of protest, organization, and education to challenge discrimination in areas such as immigration and labor. We will then examine age discrimination with the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, or ADEA, which forbids discrimination against people who are age 40 and over. Lastly, we will take a look at the state of race and racism in the light of cases such as Trayvon Martin and the more recent reaction to George Floyd's death and the continued rise of peaceful and sometimes violent protests in response to accusations of systemic racism. The ultimate question that your author leaves us with at the end of this chapter is, how does the struggle for equality continue today in a way that draws on the lessons of past struggles while still allowing for healing across an increasingly divided society? Our discussion this week takes a look at the 1963 March on Washington, D.C., and Dr. Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. After watching the video of Dr. King's speech, you will be asked whether or not Dr. King's dream has come true today and how it stands up to the present call for addressing problems of systemic racism and continued quest for equality. Your written assignment for this week will be Current Events Paper Number 2. Please be sure to find a timely article from within the past 2 weeks in order to present an understanding of current events as they are changing constantly. I want to know how they relate to our very dynamic political environment now. All right, everybody. I want you to have a really good week, and I'll see you online.